Okay, I think we can start now. I think everyone's here. Um, Firstly, thanks everyone for joining us. As you know, this session will be recorded. My name is Joseph Chia, and I'm based at Wakayama University in Japan, although I send you my greetings from Melbourne in Australia. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you the editors and some of the contributors of this book, and to launch the book, Tourism and Development in Southeast Asia, which is published in the Routledge Contemporary Asia series. The editors of the book will be here today. You might be able to see some of them. Dr. Claudia Dolezal from the University of Westminster in the UK, Dr. Alexander Trupp from Sunway University in Malaysia, and Dr. Huong Bui from Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Japan. I think the slides should be moving. We also have five contributors available today to talk to us. They're the three lovely editors. Five contributors, Dr. Fan Hong Long, Dr. Tom Jones, Professor Devi Rosa Kausa, Professor Dieter Muller, and Dr. Nicole Häusler. As is appropriate, the editors will begin today's book launch and will map out the book for us. So I say once again, congratulations to the editors and all of the contributors.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Chia, for this kind introduction. And we got a glimpse of Professor Adams' foreword, which we will try to play again later. Okay, next, please. So, next slide, please. So it was indeed our passion for the region of Southeast Asia and our passion for tourism that brought the editors, Dr. Claudia Dolezal, Dr. Huong Tamboi, and myself together. Indeed, it's quite funny somehow that Claudia and myself actually come from the same province in Upper Austria, but it was a summer school about Southeast Asia more than 10 years ago, which made us meet the first time. Huong, we met at the University of Vienna also many years ago. And this time we often started to talk, saying that surprisingly there are not a lot of books on tourism in Southeast Asia available. And those books are meanwhile classics in the field that are available, edited by Michael Hitchcock, Victor King, Mike Parner, Wall, Michael Hall, Kaye John, and others, more generally report about tourism development in the region, and not so much if and how development may be achieved. So we said that there is no book available which analyzes tourism as an economic and socio-cultural phenomenon through the lens of development. So the focus of our book is this nexus of tourism and development with a regional approach to Southeast Asia, which is analyzing tourism development at various scales, from local, national to global. We are analyzing the role tourism plays for sustainable development in Southeast Asia by discussing both practical and theoretical implications. Therefore, the book, as has been shown briefly, is also divided into four main sections, starting with theoretical and methodological foundations, which is then followed by a section on tourism in protected areas, third, tourism impacts on local communities, and lastly, on broader issues of tourism and governance. We also want to mention that we managed to cover 8 out of the 11 countries in Southeast Asia. So while we make reference to all countries throughout the region, we have specific case studies covering all countries except Singapore, Brunei, and Timor-Leste. Moreover, we want to mention the balance we have between people from authors, contributors from within Southeast Asia and from authors contributors outside of the region. So out of the 24 authors, half of the contributors are from within Southeast Asia. So, but before we dive deeper into the contents of the book, I would like to share a little bit about the editorial and publication process, because this might be interesting for some of our attendees who maybe also consider submitting to Routledge. So we briefly share our experience. As you can see here on the timeline, it's quite a long journey. So it was more than 2 years from the time we submitted our initial proposal at the beginning of 2018 until the eventual publication in April 2020. So the pictures you see here sitting us together in the coffee house or having a drink are actually quite deceiving, because most of the time the editors and authors collaborated online. All the editors were based in very different time zones, in the UK, in Japan, in the South Pacific, which however had the advantage that almost at any time someone was working on the book. The proposal, by the way, needed to include already fully drafted chapters, the introduction plus 3 chapters, which also took a time to get organized. Then we waited several months for the reviews from Routledge. They were quite positive, except subject to minor revisions. Then we collected all the final chapter submissions, organized the reviews, authors carried out the revisions, and it was only until February 2020 when we received the final PDF galleys from Routledge, which then had to be returned very quickly back to the publishing house by beginning of March, right? And this is also the time, right, when COVID-19 started to spread globally. So that happened at the very, very final stage of the entire publication process. Therefore, COVID-19 and tourism is hardly discussed in the book, but we'll have a short outlook on the topic by Claudia later on. Okay, so what we see on the next slide is a graph of tourism development in Southeast Asia prior to COVID-19, right? It shows a very dynamic tourism development with around 130 million international tourist arrivals by 2018. We also clearly see, however, that tourism has developed quite unevenly, both within the region as well as within countries, whereas Malaysia and Thailand share more than half of all international tourist arrivals in the region. Other countries, including Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia especially, have shown quite significant growth rates in recent years. Yet, of course, we said this is not so much a book about tourism development in general, but we want to bring the concepts of tourism and development together. So for the start and the introduction, we wanted to gain an overview of the research status quo on tourism and development in Southeast Asia. And we did so by conducting an analysis of the Scopus database of research articles published between 2000 and 2019. So the idea was to map, to show the distribution, the geographical distribution of these key concepts of tourism and development across the different countries in Southeast Asia. So as you can see here on this figure on the right side, we developed 11 thematic concepts reflecting different dimensions of development. Some very general terms such as the MDGs, the SDG, sustainability as a concept as a whole, as well as other dimensions of development, and then searched these keywords for each of the 11 countries in Southeast Asia. And the results showed a quite interesting picture in the next slide. showing that the two countries which receive most international tourist arrival also reached most attention in tourism, right? These are Thailand and Malaysia, followed by Indonesia. And those countries who just opened up for tourism in the 1990s, such as the Lao PDR, or also Cambodia, Myanmar, received less scholarly attention, we could say. It also shows, interestingly, that the former Millennium Development Goals and the current Sustainable Development Goals have not been, at least not directly, analyzed at all until this point. However, I also want to mention that the upcoming special issue of the Austrian Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, which will be published by the end of this month, will have a focus on tourism and the Sustainable Development Goals in the region. The broad term sustainability was most often used in this existing research. Almost half of all of the articles we found made reference to sustainability, but often the concept has not been discussed and applied in detail. Other more common forms or dimensions of sustainable development in conjunction with tourism we found are in regards to different subforms of sustainable tourism, including community-based tourism, where participation naturally plays an important role, ecotourism and pro-poor tourism. While other areas, including environmental, ecological effects, governance, gender, and even empowerment, have been less covered by existing research on tourism and development in Southeast Asia. And these are also themes and topics that have been brought up by authors and contributors of this book, as we will see a bit later in our book launch today. Before we move on to the single case study introductions and discussions, however, my colleagues Claudia and Huong will share more about the theoretical and methodological foundations of the book.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Professor Chies. Thank you to Claudia, who are co-author for me for these chapters. So in this chapter, Claudia and me discuss about the tourism development nexus in Southeast Asia, looking into the histories and the current issues, and the tourism development, practice against the theory of development. So we actually go through reviewing 4 different paradigms of development: modernization, dependency, sustainable development, and alternative development, and the practice of tourism in Southeast Asia against the backdrop of these 4 paradigms. So to start with the modernizations, so you would see the background pictures, which is one of the very famous island in southern Vietnam, which is Phu Quoc Islands. It used to be a primitive and a very less development about like 10 years ago, but recently become a hotspot of tourism development with a lot of resorts around that area. So that illustrates for the modernization paradigm and its implementation in tourism development, as tourism being one of the most important sectors in many Asian, Southeast Asia economy, particularly for Thailand. And also it's growing important for Vietnam, for Indonesia, and Singapore, and Laos, and Cambodia, of course. And mass tourism in Southeast Asia taking the form of 3 S, Sun, Sea, and Sand, which best illustrate for the principle of modernizations: get foreign money, develop facilities, transforming the environment into modern resort, and get back from the investment. However, the resort and coastal tourism has been problematic in the region, and the major problem is a leakage of foreign currency, leakage of the resources as a key issues when it comes to mass tourism dominated by foreign influence in terms of investment and in terms of market as well. As we can see, the COVID-19 now is almost kind of impact very significantly on the tourism in Southeast Asia, because the main customer for this resort are coming from overseas. And when international flights are banned, that was really hard to get the visitors. So international and alternative and more niche form of tourism, unfortunately, also been transferred into mass phenomenon. For example, backpacking used to be a niche type of tourism in Southeast Asia, with several backpacker enclave in Ho Chi Minh City, in Khao San in Bangkok. It's now been transformed into a mass form of tourism, and has similar thing with heritage tourism. Is once is a niche, now it's a mass. So yeah, and the conventional image of resort, we can be seen in the next slide, which is like this, a modern. So a primitive beach in Phu Quoc now transformed into modern resort with a lot of modification of the environment, and definitely it affects on the relocation of residents and transforms the environment for tourism purpose. And this type of development lead projects impose a kind of non-reversible change. It's impossible for the environment to come back to the previous state. So moving on to the next paradigm is dependency. Before talking about the dependency, we also need to talk about the market for Southeast Asia. Where tourists are coming from. So majority of tourists are coming from North Asia, particularly China, over the last 10 years, in addition to more traditional market in North Asia, including Japan at the beginning, and then followed by Korea, and now dominated by Chinese visitors. So the importance of Chinese market is significant for almost all countries in Southeast Asia. And then because close between China and India, the Southeast Asia market also attract a lot of visitors from South Asia, like India, mainly from India. And the another is from Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, because of the geographical proximity. So these three generating market sending tourists to Southeast Asia. And you will see in geographical locations, marine Southeast Asia exposed a great advantage of having tropical beach, and that would be a favorable condition for sun, sea, and sand tourism development. So moving on to the next paradigm that we discuss here is the dependency paradigm. Many countries in Southeast Asia, majority of countries in Southeast Asia have a colonial legacy from French and from British, and also from the Dutch in Indonesia. So with Southeast Asia colonial legacy, tourism symbolizes the hedonic phase of neo-colonialism, and the colonial legacy continue to make impact in tourism marketing, destination image, as well as a fantasy about Southeast Asia. The colonial infrastructures development during the colonial time still play an important role in shaping the modern day tourism, like the transportation, railway system, hill station concept, and even the service mindset and architectures of the hotel are so much influenced by colonial heritage, colonial legacy. However, post-colonial representation of Asian cultures often portrays Asia, Southeast Asia as a primitive and relatively pre-modern to satisfy the Western desires and fantasies. And one form of tourism that best illustrates for the colonial and dependency paradigm is ethnic tourism that has largely emerged out of the colonial design to portray the others in the highland area in Southeast Asia, like in Chiang Mai, in Central Highland in Vietnam, in Sapa, in Laos, best illustrate for this the presence of dependency paradigm in Southeast Asia. So moving on, please. To the next discussion is linking to the theme of our book, is development, sustainable development. When I review the literature, I'm quite surprised to see that there is a really big differences in the conceptualization of development and sustainable development. And sustainable tourism and sustainable development are not necessarily in line with each other. In some area in Southeast Asia, sustainability of tourism is defined as the ongoing growth and survival of the industry instead of sustainable practice. And the criticism for Southeast Asian tourism development is that it's increasingly recognized unstable practice, and that really need to take actions. Yeah. So what going to be another alternative paradigm? Is that better for Southeast Asia? However, there is a lot of critical debate on Southeast Asian tourism development from indigenous researchers, and that is one of the purpose why, when we are editing this book, we try to include more researchers from the region, so they can bring the voice, they can bring the view, and they can bring the practice from the region. So the contribution of indigenous researchers definitely will close the gap that existing in tourism research concerning development. However, we have to identify that opportunity for rural community to engage in ecotourism, community-based tourism, and other alternative forms like a homestay, agritourism, or backpacking would contribute, and this would lead to a sustainable alternative development. And we do have to mention that the theme of community-based tourism with trekking, motorbike, homestay, conscious food, textile, encouraging the local practice and local to participate in tourism is a step forward to an alternative and sustainable development of tourism. So now I will hand on to Claudia for concluding remark on the theory of development in tourism. Claudia, please.
Thank you, Huong. I'll jump in and do the concluding remarks. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So what we really are saying in this chapter is that modernization theory is still a very much dominating paradigm in the region. So it is not a thing of the past, and so is mass tourism. Mass tourism is not a thing of the past in Southeast Asia, particularly with resort destinations still on the rise. It is a reality of the region, and it will always be part of the identity of Southeast Asian tourism. So this is despite the region showing really strong efforts in alternative tourism. But what we also see is that these forms of tourism do, of course, due to their very nature, remain small scale and an addition to mass tourism. So very interestingly, what we also see, and maybe what we haven't quite focused on in the book yet, but which probably future publications will also focus on, is this dependency on Asian markets, particularly on the Chinese market. So we see new dependency relationships, maybe not necessarily with Western markets, but with new Asian markets, which Huong was also talking about a little bit already. So with these changing new markets, what we really see is that the tourism development nexus will keep evolving further, and that really we need to somehow also move on from the development theories we've seen in the past to maybe other development theories that will also help us explain this shift in dependency. I'd like to move on now to the third chapter in part one of the book, which myself, Alex, and Prasit co-authored. Prasit is from the University of Chiang Mai, and this chapter is quite special for us, and because it's also a very personal chapter. The focus of this chapter is really the methodological challenges we're facing when we do research in the region, particularly fieldwork, and particularly using ethnography. This is a method that has seen quite a lot of use in the past in the region. Kathleen Adams, who you've just very briefly, due to technical problems, seen in the foreword, is one of the quite popular ethnographists in the region, but just one of many, of course. And we, all three of us, as you can see us in the photos, have got experience doing ethnography, particularly in Thailand and in Indonesia. These are the two countries that we have focused very much of our research on. And what we're looking at in this chapter is really we're sharing the fieldwork challenges that we have ourselves experienced, but also others have experienced doing ethnographic research in the region. So we're really talking about foreign fields, which is for Alex and myself, being originally from Austria, doing research in the region, but also in familiar fields with it, which is really Prasit's perspective, being from northern Thailand. In this chapter, we're using the practice of reflexivity, which we think isn't used enough yet. We do think that we can take ourselves out of the research we do, not because of self-indulgence, but because of actually being interpretive researchers and qualitative researchers as we are, And we really think that we need to trust these subjective realities within and really locate our research there as well. So fieldwork really is information that is gathered through relationships. So we think that these dynamics that emerge in the field encounter with informants, participants, whatever we might call them, is important to make known. So this is important to write about. Whereas in the past, maybe we haven't necessarily written about that because it would have shown that the anthropologist has maybe failed. It would have shown that maybe we have doubts or emotions, and we think that it's important to talk about these. So it's our experience in the field where knowledge production happens, and we do think we need to look towards these discomforts as well. So there are three thematic areas we're focusing on in the chapter. We're looking at this idea of the insider versus outsider, which we think is particularly interesting because we have both research at home, but also research in foreign fields featuring in the chapter. So this emic versus ethic perspective has really, since Malinowski's idea of fieldwork, shown us that the idea is that the anthropologist gets so close to the culture that they will feel like a native. But of course, that isn't always the case. We often rely on interpreters, on assistants, particularly in times where we are under time pressures to deliver as well. And we have increasingly less time to do research and funding as well. So we really look at these three areas and also the power relations, lastly, with the research participants in the field. Three perspectives are offered in the chapter. It's myself who's done research on community-based tourism in Bali, then Alex doing research on Aka vendors in Bangkok, and Prasit doing research in northern Thailand with the Huong indigenous people. So I'm starting off sort of looking at the difficulties and disillusionments of entering a very foreign field, a field where I had never done research before, the challenges of finding indifference amongst research participants that actually you were hoping to participate freely and voluntarily and happily, and the challenges really of fishing for facts to overcome this distance, this cultural distance, and really making the foreign familiar, but also being reliant on interpreters to understand the context, feeling maybe a little bit disempowered at the end because I was so dependent on other people's help while doing my fieldwork. Alex, on the opposite, was feeling a little bit more empowered when he started off his fieldwork that he's talking about here in the city of Bangkok. And he's really saying that he felt very endowed with social capital. He had social relationships, he had a research permit, he had known the country before. So he was quite self-secure when entering the field, but was still feeling frustrated at times because people kept asking him why he was researching women vendors as a man, or you know, what the role of his interpreter was, who was Thai but not necessarily from the same background as those being researched. And then lastly, which is really a highlight for us, is a perspective that maybe isn't necessarily shared that often, which is Prasit talking about doing indigenous research as an indigenous Thai himself, and really something that we would say is doing research at home. But what he's showing here is that this is something that is often romanticized as producing more truthful accounts of research and more truthful data, when he's actually showing that there are also certain challenges when entering this home or familiar field. So what he's really saying is that people generally tended to give him more information because he was Huong himself, but he never felt like he became a true insider in his research. There are different clans also amongst those populations. And also he had a very ambiguous role, being indigenous himself, but also being a researcher and hence having an agenda to a certain extent. As he's saying, and I'm quoting him here, therefore, we could say in metaphorical terms, I had just entered their living room, but was not allowed in the kitchen, while Thai and foreign tourists can stay only in the front yard. So we really like this idea of actually, looking at the indigenous researcher as also not being able to completely reach the people that we work with. So concluding thoughts are really that the access to the field really depends not just on our cultural background and where we are from, but also on gender, gatekeepers, relationships in the field, but also the time we spent there. We also are emphasizing in this chapter that we need to acknowledge more the role of cultural brokers, the role of interpreters, maybe look at their world views and acknowledge them, analyze them, because we think that this hasn't sufficiently been acknowledged in the past. And this quote that I put in the slide here is quite a good one, where it actually says, there is neither a comfortable insider nor a comfortable outsider position to do research from. So we do think that it's turning towards these discomforts, these moments of difference, to really analyze these complex power relations in the field and to make our research more rigorous in the region of Southeast Asia. So it's really no longer about questioning the need for reflexivity. It's really about how do we do reflexive research, and that's really what we should work with in the future as well. Okay, so I would like to herewith round up part one of the book, which we have presented as editors, and I would like to open up the floor now to our 5 authors that have also contributed to the book with valuable chapters. So I'm going to hand over to Joseph to contribute the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Claudia and Alexander and Huong Bui for your presentations. That sets up the rest of the webinar nicely. And they strategically managed to choose a person from 5 individual Southeast Asian case studies. And the first one is by Dr. Pham Hong Long and Ecotourism and Sustainable Development in Vietnam's Protected Areas. Long, are you there and ready to take over?
Let me introduce the chapter. Our chapter, namely Ecotourism and Sustainable Tourism Development in Vietnam, Protected Area. So I co-writing with Dr. Bùi Thanh Huong from the College of Asia Pacific Study. And this chapter including 4 parts. Or the first part is introduction, second part is financing protected areas, third part is ecotourism and revenue revelation for protected area, and the fourth part is discussion and conclusion. So actually in Vietnam right now we have 33 national parks, and divided into 2 types. One is managed by the Ministry of Rural Development and Agriculture, and another type is belong to the local provinces. So we have 6 national parks belong to the Ministry of Rural Development and Agriculture, and 27 belong to local provinces. And most, in fact, in Vietnam, ecotourism is just started development in around 1995, when we, because in 1994, we have the release from the embargo from USA. So the ecotourism is quite new in Vietnam, not like in other countries. Now, for the financing protected area sources, I mean for the protected area in Vietnam, where the funding sources is normally come from 3 sources. The first one is state basis, channel through the central and local level. Second one is income from the supply of forest and environmental services. And the third one is funding for support from the domestic and foreign organization and individual. For the ecotourism and revenue generation for protected in Vietnam, the sources is coming from entrance fee, the ecotourism services, lease for ecotourism development, joint venture and for ecotourism development, payment for environmental services, investment for infrastructure, subcontract for forests protected, and fund for community development. So in fact, the most of the revenue coming from investment for infrastructure and payment for environmental services. And for tourism, ecotourism service, it is only accounting for 2.3% percentage in Vietnam. And for the payment for that in environmental services, it normally comes from three sources. The first one is soil protection and erosion control. The second one is water regulation and supply. And the third one is biodiversity conservation and natural landscape beauty. In fact, tourism service provider only contribute 1 to 2% of the revenue, which accounting for less than 0.23 of the payment for forest environmental services in Vietnam. And the challenge for the implementation of payment forest environment service, we have some challenge. The first one is tourism stakeholder are diverse in terms of business location, size, and products. The second one is protected area management board is considered is the forest owner, and it is therefore both a provider and recipient of PFAS. The third one is law and regulation, is the direct payment applied without agreement with the payer on the payment level. And the fourth one is the guideline, the lack of clear implementation guideline for PFAS, for landscape beauty and biodiversity conservation. For the revenue from the ecotourism services, it comes from three forms. The first one is self-management tourism business by the pack management, and the second one is land and forest for lease of private enterprise, and the third one is joint venture between park and management and private business. For the discussion, we are having the innovative and traditional form of financing protected area, the development of innovation financing mechanism for ecotourism such as PFAS, in addition to the traditional form of financing. For example, entrance fee and ecotourism service is expecting to increasing the funding for protected area. And the second one is having compared revenue from three options of for financing PA from ecotourism. This one exists in the design and implementation of all three options of PFAS, entrance fee, and ecotourism services. We also have the top-down central plan approach. Also, all three forms of ecotourism-driven financing are designed as market-based option. The government defines the payment framework, regulates the payment mechanism designed on the type of service, identifies the buyer and seller, and ensure that the transaction of the payment occur. This top-down centrally planned approach to PFAS is in sharp contrast with the approach in other EU markets instrument. And in fact,
1 more minute.
Vietnam ecotourism seems to be the must ecotourism. Ecotourism aim at maximizing economic benefits driven by the large scale of tourism at the expense of environmental and social sustainable. And low price for entrance tickets make ecotourism in context affordable for various social groups, thus fulfilling the social objective of making natural science accessible to all social classes. So for conclusion, limitation of impedes the development of alternative mechanism for PA financial, including inadequate legal and institutional framework for resources management, which reflect transitional periods from a central planned economic to market-based economy. The development of ecotourism in national park require radical changes in management structure, and awareness of ecotourism is a tool for biodiversity protection should be promoted as the replacement for the conventional and current view of ecotourism as an economic tool. So that's all. Actually, I would like to show on the slide, the screen, so it's easy for me to talk.
Okay.
That's all for the chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Long. Thank you very much for giving us that background on ecotourism and sustainable development in Vietnam. Now we go to a different country context with Dr. Thomas Jones from Ritsumeikan APU in Japan. Searching for sustainable tourism in Malaysia, can Langkawi Geopark Rangers offer improved stewardship? Over to you, Tom.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, congratulations, Huong and Alex and Claudia and everyone, all of us. I'm just going to share a couple of slides very briefly from Langkawi. I'm not from Malaysia, but I did write this chapter with my master's student, who is. Okay, so Langkawi, this tropical island, paradise really, on the border of Malaysia and Thailand here in the Andaman Sea. Yeah, the angle we were looking at was this UNESCO Geoparks program. So Langkawi, I believe, was the first geopark in Southeast Asia. It's also a great place to be looking at right now, you know, in the kind of pandemic. It's one of these island paradises which has enjoyed more or less unbroken increase in tourism numbers. It's got a really interesting background. It was developed quite aggressively, directly under the jurisdiction of the Prime Minister's office with the Langkawi authority, the local authority, the LADA, the development agency, investing a lot of money in infrastructure projects. And you can see the effect of the tourist numbers here. It's also an island. So one thing I always tell the students, you know, tourism numbers, notoriously unreliable. Because we do have ports of entry here, you know, these figures are more reliable, which is another reason for choosing Langkawi as well. So very briefly, this was what the chapter was about, these geopark rangers, this issue of stewardship in wildlife tourism and protected areas across Southeast Asia. Yes, Alex was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of talk about sustainable development in Southeast Asia as elsewhere, still to see the evidence of it. So we were really looking for that in the case of Langkawi here. Yeah, some good data thanks to my student. And I also was lucky enough to visit a couple of times. This is, wow, 7 years ago now. So that was just when they just introduced this new ranger system. So the rangers, they're going to be the kind of eyes and ears on the ground, and we met up with some of these rangers, and they gave us some primary data, their logbooks and things, which we analyzed in terms of the management organization, also the kind of profile, the kind of people that were doing this job, so the rangers themselves, and a kind of content analysis, text mining on their monthly reports in these different geopark sites. Yeah, so that's it really. I mean, as I say, Langkawi has, you know, it really kind of shines a light on a lot of these sustainable tourism issues. Here you see some jet skis speeding through the mangroves, so the wake kind of sloshing over the side and eroding these mangroves, issues in the bat caves, you know, so loads of good stuff going on there. And yeah, I think a lot more research needed really on these rangers and as the gatekeepers, storytellers, and, you know, thinking about what's happened since then. Certainly places like Boracay, which kind of preempted the lockdown, didn't it, 2018? Boracay was closed for about 6 months. And if we look at where we are now, then, you know, and where we're going to go from here, then yeah, definitely Langkawi is worth another look. So that's it. That's my 2 cents. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Joseph, we can't hear you.
And Joseph, I'm actually going to have to sign off to another meeting at 6. Okay. So thank you very much, guys. Yeah, and I really appreciate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Jones. Our next speaker is Professor Devi Rosa Kausar from Indonesia. Her chapter is Collaborative Conservation on Small Islands Towards Community Empowerment and Sustainable Tourism in Kepulauan Seribu, Jakarta. Over to you, Devi.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. Joseph, for the introduction. Okay, I will try the share screen now.
And do make sure you click on security and turn off the annotate function.
Okay. Wait. Security.
It's
okay.
When you go down. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity for us to present our chapters here. I'm with my co-authors, Farul Rozi Darmawan and Riza Firmansyah from Pancasila University. And we would like to thank the editors for their guidance, patience. So this book actually is happening, and we are having this event right now. So our challenge in writing this chapter is actually because this is coming from a project. So this is not actually a real research that you do, that we did by design. So this was a collaborative project which was involving about 5 NGOs and 1 universities and the management of the national park itself. And let me tell you about the locus of this project. So we had this project in the Thousand Islands Regency, so Kepulauan Seribu Regency. It is just off the north coast of Jakarta. And some part of it is actually a national park in which we did this project. The project itself is named Save Our Small Islands Project. So it is aimed at empowering the communities in taking part in addressing environmental issues. And what are the environmental issues that the islands have? So some of the strategic issues are garbage, because these islands is located just off the north coast of Jakarta, which is a metropolitan area. And then garbage from tourism activities, and then freshwater problem, and environmental impacts of tourism. So what these 5 NGOs did with the money that we got from quite a big donor, HSBC, is to do all sorts of project. Some projects. For instance, like reducing plastic and styrofoam for guides, boat owners, and also the communities who are, serving the catering and having homestays, waste management and recycling, and then environmental education for students, socioeconomic survey, and we tried also to train them how to cultivate productive plants. So what we aim to achieve in this project is from the collaborative conservation project that was done by these parties, we will then have community participation and empowerment, and then this will hopefully lead to sustainable tourism. Now, the opportunities and challenges is that although the community is involved in this program is entirely dependent on donors. So the expected outputs are predetermined by another stakeholder, which is not the community themselves. However, we had some early signs that some communities are continuing the initiatives on their own. And another challenge is that as a collaborative conservation activity, there's a challenge in presenting a compilation of outputs from different NGOs, doing some intervention in the community, in the homestay, and some intervention in how people will do their diving and snorkeling more sustainably. So we have a range of recommendation, but we haven't come up with a clearly defined plan containing recommended priorities for the future, because communicating between these stakeholders is also a challenge in terms of a time where we should meet, and we also have sometimes different objectives based on our organization. So we as writers, we have another challenge in putting this into a contextual framework, because it is actually a practical project that we try to share with you in the South Asian context of how collaborative conservation can be done in a protective area. And I think that's it for me. And I look forward for questions later. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and to your co-authors as well. Indonesia is always very interesting to learn about. Our next speaker, Professor Dieter Muller, has talked to us from Umeå in Sweden, but he's talking about his chapter, which was co-authored with Saitong Phomavong, titled, "What is the Economic Impact of Ecotourism for the Poor in Laos?" Over to you, Dieter.
Thank you very much. I tried to share the screen with you and hope everything is working out well. Okay, so hopefully that will do. Yes, that's the topic of our chapter, and it's mainly, I mean, actually the empirical work for this chapter was mainly done by Saitong Phomavong, who was at that time a doctoral student with me at Umeå University, and he's himself a Lao and a resident of the north of Laos, and he was very committed, and he still is, to issues of poverty reduction and development issues in the north of Laos. And so he did a lot of the field work with colleagues, because he was enrolled with us within the framework of a wider kind of capacity building project that the Swedish Development Agency was funding and enabled about 30 or 40 Lao doctoral students to gain a degree. And he's now working with the National University of Laos. Our point of departure was that in the late 90s, I mean, tourism was introduced to Laos. I think often, I mean, we forget about this, that tourism is a rather new phenomenon. And it was always kind of argued that tourism was there for sustaining culture and nature, as well as for poverty reduction. And it was kind of very much framed with the idea of pro-poor tourism, and it was very much donor-driven. And I think it's very important to note here at the outset that probably the true motive for developing tourism was not really developing tourism. It was protecting nature and also fighting drug production, because we are now here in the area usually called Golden Triangle. So it was very much kind of a donor-driven process. And a lot of these different agencies that were in place in the area had ideas about community-based ecotourism as a way of promoting tourism. And if you look at the literature, it was not so much about the economic impact. And Saitong, I mean, being a resident of the North, was very concerned about these kind of different developments, which were at the time of the empirical work, maybe some 10 years old or so. So he was kind of thinking, I mean, okay, there are different ways forward. And he argued that it's to him unclear what actually the economic impacts of such efforts were, and whether they actually really kind of reached or achieved what they were set off for. So this aim of the study was to look at different projects, and the projects were on the one hand privately owned, on the other hand publicly owned tourism enterprises, very much around lodges that were kind of set up in rural communities. And that was the one thing, and the other thing was to look at the redistribution and of the economic impacts, and to actually look whether the economic benefits would be, or whether the economic impacts would be for the benefit of the poorest in those villages. These are just two random pictures. It's not actually the site surveyed, but I think it just aims at kind of illustrating the differences in tourism development, where you on the one hand had this kind of idea of really community-based tourism that was driven by local initiatives, that were driven by often then by the local tourist authorities who kind of had some kind of ownership on the one hand, or alternatively, this kind of more privately owned ventures. In that case of Saitong, it was a village in the north that was kind of given a lodge. It was set up by the German Development Agency, and later on transferred to a company called Exotissimo, which I think now is Exo Tourism, and run as a kind of a really economic and business venture. If we looked at the literature then, I mean, we could see that, I mean, a lot of the literature actually was not really interested in the economic outcomes at that time. It was mainly kind of a question of the ideological underpinnings of the proposed measures. So community-based tourism was not necessarily kind of celebrated because of its economic impacts for the poorest, but rather for its kind of ideological idea of sharing and including everybody. And Saitong was a little bit frustrated with that, to be honest, and thought there should be, I mean, he would like to have a closer look at that. And at the same time, we realized that there were few quantitative studies around because of a lack of reliable data. And even the data that was available at the time from the public tourist authorities was not something that seems to be too trustworthy, and rather kind of probably showed something that was desired rather than actual. So Saitong tried to do kind of his own surveys with his field assistants, and surveyed these two villages, and actually Nam Talan and Lao Khao, and in the north of Laos, and actually was reaching 75% of all village households, and asking them to what extent they actually had some benefits of tourism or not, and also what kind of benefits, what kind of incomes they had. Just to give you an idea what this could be about, it was kind of cooking fees, it was guiding fees, it was money for providing agricultural produce, and so on and so on. He used then quantitative methodology actually to kind of analyze the data and looked through Gini coefficients and quintile share analysis to what extent actually the income was evenly distributed among those villages surveyed. Maybe not as a surprise, tourism income was, even in those cases surveyed, unevenly distributed independent of the ownership of the lodges. So it was not a big difference between the publicly run and the privately run lodges, although actually the privately one performed better in terms of sharing money to even the poorest in the communities. And Saitong's and our conclusion was simply that the poor are too poor and too marginalized in order to partake in tourism production. They simply did not have the means and the assets to contribute something to tourism, and could thus not really benefit from the positive impacts of tourism or the economic impacts of tourism either. Furthermore, it was obviously also a question of trust, transparency, and tradition that also affected how the outcome of tourism was. Saitong, in other studies, he looked, for instance, at gender issues and so on, where you could see that in the Lao Khao village, for instance, traditional gender roles in a way hindered the women in partaking in tourism and thus also being able to benefit from it, just to give you another explanation. So in the end of the day, the village middle classes were the winners of the tourism development, because the rich guys in the village were actually still engaged in agriculture and those productions that enabled them to gain far more money than tourism would allow them to do. While the poorest, as I said, were too much marginalized actually. But at the end of the day, what we also could see was that private solutions were as effective as public ownership. And hence, it was kind of a conclusion that we drew that independent of the form of organization, the mode of organization, it needs other efforts in order to reach the poorest of the poor. Actually, I mean, Saitong's point was that in order to actually fight poverty among the poorest in Laos, far more effort should be given to backward linkages and inclusion of those people in tourism projects. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Dieter Muller, all the way from Sweden, and his co-author, Saitong Huong. Our final speaker is still in Europe. Dr. Nicole Häusler is an academic and practitioner speaking to us from Berlin, and her chapter is titled Tourism Development in Myanmar, Dynamics, Policies and Challenges. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you. Just hang on for a second. Okay. Thanks a lot. Also, yeah, greetings from Berlin and for inviting me for this presentation. I'm talking on behalf of the three authors. Just regarding our background, we have not undertaken research. Our focus was on tourism development in Myanmar, dynamics, policies, and challenges. But Frauke Gras is a professor of geography from the University of Cologne in Germany, and she has been teaching in Myanmar since more than 15 years at the University of Yangon. And my colleague Zinoi Mint is a scholar of this University of Yangon. Me, myself, yes, I'm teaching, I'm keeping an honorary professorship for at the University of Eberswalde near Berlin on sustainable tourism development, but most of the time I'm actually living and working in Myanmar since 2013 as a tourism consultant. So our article is not based on a specific research, it's based more on literature review, on interviews, but also a lot on participatory observation. we have been, the content of our article is, of course, we are starting with an introduction, then we give an overview of the tourism structures in Myanmar. We talk about the development of the tourism policy since 2014. And then we focused on the new trends in tourism development since 2015, because 2015 was the time when the elections took place and the National League of Democracy, the former opposition party, took over and was leading the government. And the final chapters, we were focusing on current challenges to tourism development, including recommendations. I'm just giving now a brief introduction into the characteristics of Myanmar and on the current challenges in terms of tourism development. Characteristics, I'm just mentioning now figures. In 2018, Myanmar had around 3.5 million international visitors who were spending average daily $122 and staying for 9 days average. The Asian nationals, mostly from China, Thailand, and Japan, comprise the largest visitor group with approximately 76%, followed by Western Europeans, 30% mainly from France, the UK, and Germany. What are the challenges? And the challenges are especially also related now with the opening of the country. Suddenly from 2014-15 onwards, the country had the duplication of visitor arrivals, domestic tourism was arising. So what we can observe is a lot of negative environmental impacts already on tourism hotspots, resulting from inadequate waste disposal and wastewater management. But there are no really strong activities to do something against it. There are increasingly vocal complaints of planned large-scale investment leads to displacement of local communities. And here I'm especially pointing on Tanintari state, which is actually the Miek archipelago, which is opposite of Thailand. If you are in Phuket and looking towards the sea, on the other side are all these islands which are belonging to Myanmar, and of course you can imagine there are a lot of investors now trying to start large-scale projects in that area. There we can observe a rising land prices and conflicts over use of land in Myanmar when it's related to tourism. Definitely there has been a lack of implementation of tourism policies and master plans. After the opening of the country, there was a policy compiled on responsible tourism, a policy of community involvement in tourism, ecotourism policy, a tourism master plan, but this has been just papers. There was no, I would say, willingness or capability by the government also to introduce them. Yes, and what we can observe more and more is a lack of preparedness and awareness about the consequences of tourism by local people. Especially with the new government, community-based tourism became very popular. There was more or less an order by the government, please implement as many community-based projects as possible. There was an order for the tour operators, for local governments, or even for the donor organizations without even realizing what does this mean for the communities. If we talk about recommendations, what we feel is in terms of Myanmar tourism development for the future, what is definitely needed are integrated sustainable destination management planning structures, including very important environmental and social impact assessments before any bigger projects are even starting. A much stronger involvement of local communities into tourism planning from the very beginning at the micro level already, because it's still a very centralized organization. Everything, all the decisions are taken still in the capital city. What we definitely see as a chance is actually tourism as a tool for peace and conflict resolution in Myanmar, which is still not also seen by a lot of donor organizations. We have more than ethnic armed groups still in Myanmar. And if you really want to develop what is now called ecotourism, adventure tourism, you have to deal also with these ethnic armed groups and their civil organizations, and which then maybe can also lead to more peace in that region. And I think here is potentially a lot here's a lot of potential in this regard. But again, what I'm worried about is that there is still a big lack of transparency, which will cause more conflicts in the future between communities, local authorities, and investors. And this new product development, especially now within COVID-19, everyone is now talking in Myanmar in nature-based, spiritual, meditation-based and domestic tourism. Yes, we have to think about it, but first, all these kind of topics needs to be into consideration. Yeah, environmental awareness, involvement of local communities, etc., etc. So what is needed for Myanmar, from our point of view, is a carefully crafted strategies and systematic planning. Thanks a lot for listening, and I hope there might be also some question from your side.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole, for your very informative presentation of Myanmar. As you can see, everyone, all of the case studies point out how complex tourism is, and the challenge is constantly balancing the economic and the social and the ecological imperatives in each case. I will now hand over to Dr. Claudia Dolezal. We might try and show Professor Kathleen Adams' presentation. So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you. Let me just do this. Okay. All right. Can you see my screen? Great. Okay, so let's hope this works.
Hi, I'm delighted to offer my congratulations to the editors and the contributors to tourism and development in Southeast Asia. There's been really a palpable need for a compendium of ethnographically grounded case studies offering insights into the complexities of what I like to call lassoing tourism for good in Southeast Asia. Until now, there's been no single one volume that both systematically interrogates the sort of classic tourism as development paradigms and also offers insights concerning best practices drawn from really detailed and rich case studies. This book will enhance our awareness of existing local and regional and national level challenges. And it will also give us a kind of path that we can look to for encouraging tourism to unfold in places and have a more uniformly positive role in Southeast Asian community members' lives. So congratulations to the editors and the contributors for a very fine book. And have
Okay. All right, so I'm going to share. Thank you to Kathleen for writing our wonderful foreword to the book and for speaking for 2 minutes or so at our book launch. It's probably middle of the night in the States, which is why Kathleen sent this video over as a file. So hopefully you can see my presentation now. Is this working? Yeah, great. Okay, so I wanted to just really spend 5 minutes after the contributors who have presented and been sticking very much to the time. Thank you so much. I wanted to talk 5 minutes about the current situation in the region when it comes to tourism and development, particularly in a time of COVID-19, and maybe also looking into the future. And of course, I am not the COVID-19 expert, but I just wanted to offer some food for thought, maybe also for the discussion later on. And also because, as Alex said earlier, the book really hasn't looked at the current health crisis and how this impacts on tourism and development because of the timing of the book and when it was released. So I wanted to start with a question that actually Professor Cheer was asking in a recent paper he published in Tourism Geographies. What will the tourism landscape and indeed the world look like after the pandemic? And I think it's something we're asking ourselves as well for the region of South and particularly when it comes to tourism's role that it plays for development in the region. And I wanted to really emphasize, first of all, the huge impact that this health crisis is having in a mainly economic sense, first of all, but also in a sense that people are losing their livelihoods due to the crisis. So if we look at the ILO statistics, actually, and we look at the Asia-Pacific region as a whole, more than 3 in 4 workers in the tourism sector are in formal jobs. And I think it's something we really have to emphasize, which leaves these people especially vulnerable with very few alternatives and alternative livelihoods at the moment. So the ILO estimates that in this area of the world, the Asia Pacific, 15.3 million workers are at risk as a result of COVID-19. So what we're also seeing, and what I've read quite frequently now, researching on the web, is the social distancing measures, also in the region of Southeast Asia. You can see a picture here, and tour operators and really being worried that this maybe isn't enough to protect tourists, but also to protect residents alike for the future, and to get tourism back on track. What we're also seeing is increasing travel bubbles emerging, not just within the region and between nations, but also we're seeing increasing bubbles within destinations. So, for example, Thailand is possibly getting international tourists back at some point soon, but is actually trying to potentially isolate certain tourist groups on islands where they are easier to manage, to sort of contain the spread of the pandemic. But there are also opportunities that come with this, and one of these opportunities is domestic tourism. And I think in Southeast Asia we are seeing some really strong examples, such as Vietnam, that is even with a marketing campaign trying to foster local tourism and really trying to look at a kind of tourist that has often been forgotten, also in academic research. It's the domestic tourist. So destinations such as Hoi An are now actually opening up for the domestic traveler. Vietnam has flattened the curve really quickly. But we also see other examples, such as Malaysia, where AirAsia as an airline has actually started an initiative whereby the members in the country of Malaysia are getting unlimited flights for a certain amount of money within the country to 16 domestic destinations. So very interesting initiatives are emerging. Capturing new markets, so this domestic market, moving away maybe from over-relying on single markets such as the Chinese market, but also maybe capturing a more sustainable traveler, and maybe also a traveler that really goes to more rural areas rather than cities. So what remains questionable, obviously, is whether we are maybe repeating the over-tourism problem in more rural areas rather than in urban areas after this pandemic. Is this where we're moving to, a touristification of different spaces, potentially? We're also seeing the return of wildlife, particularly marine wildlife, for example, in Thailand. And also Thailand actually is potentially deciding for the future to close certain national parks 2 months in a year to give nature space to breathe. And I think this is a very interesting development we've seen in the past, also with Maya Bay and Boracay Island in the Philippines being closed to tourists to give nature space to breathe. So where are we going with this pandemic, and what does it lead us to? Does it lead us to a more sustainable form of tourism? That's the question. And above all, something that is very important for me as well, given that I look very much at the social aspect of sustainability, is, are we maybe finally putting residents' priorities first? As we're seeing here in the quote by Dominique Lapointe, he's saying that actually we're now seeing that we're ending up with infrastructures that are tailored for a mobile demand, for the touristic demand, for the international traveler. And we're really left with that, and we really need to rethink how we can use these structures to maybe connect them more with the local needs, which is what really the local population is asking for. So is this maybe a time where local residents are potentially reclaiming power and have an opportunity to reclaim power. And this is a quote I'm going to read to you because it really it struck me and I found it quite interesting, which is about the sort of international tourists returning to the island of Bali. For me, this idea that Bali will die without tourists comes uncomfortably close to a white savior narrative, implying that local people have no choice but to hunker down, endure this crisis until foreigners start showing up again to rescue them. Such framing strips Indonesians of their agency in rising to meet this challenge, something they're quite capable of doing and have done many times before. So are we really maybe confronted with an opportunity here now to reclaim power locally, but also move away from more from the international tourist towards the domestic visitor? That's maybe something, food for thought. And lastly, I really wanted to reconnect this current time to tourism and development specifically in the region. So as we see, the United Nations are actually saying that the Sustainable Development Goals are more pressing than ever at the moment because of the second induced crisis on livelihoods and on all of the SDGs. Really reaching the SDGs is more important than ever. But of course, we have to keep critical of the SDGs. And actually, this is taken from a paper that Alex and myself have written and that is forthcoming in a few weeks, where we're actually saying that we are seeing that the world has come to a turning point, rethinking consumption, mobility, how we do business. But is this really this alternative way of thinking, this degrowth scenario that a lot of us are having in mind at the moment, is this really in parallel, or does it fit with the often private sector driven philosophy and the very capitalist embedded philosophy of the SDGs that they have been criticized for quite regularly? We think a new research agenda is required, one that views tourism as the powerful, but at the same time volatile sector that it really is. And just lastly, we wanted to emphasize that the role that tourism plays for development in the region is more important than ever before in the current time. So we do think that our book obviously still has relevance, despite the fact that it hasn't specifically addressed COVID-19. So without further ado, I would like to open up the floor for discussion. I think Joseph has actually taken notes of some questions. And then in the end, I would like to announce the social media prize winners.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, everyone. Look, there's a few questions here, and I'm not sure how much time we've got, but we'll try and address some of them. One of the bigger questions is where to after COVID-19, right? But I suppose that's a very unfair question because it's still unfolding and we don't know that. So perhaps, do any of the editors want to answer that question? Or perhaps, Claudia, you've already addressed that to some degree, right? Because there are still, in the words of a very famous American, there are lots of known knowns and known unknowns and unknowns unknowns, right?
Yeah, right. Thank you, Joseph. So the question is where to after COVID-19, and I think maybe Alex and Huong can say something on that as well. But I personally believe that there is obviously lots of hope at the moment to move towards more sustainable form of tourism finally. But I also have a feeling that we are potentially going quite quickly back towards where we have been before in terms of tourism, towards an over-reliance on the international traveler, an over-reliance on single markets once things are getting more back to normal. But I think the question is how long this period at the moment is going to last and how much chance it's going to give us to really rethink tourism and recalibrate tourism for local residents' needs. We do have to be realistic and pragmatic here as well. The economic impact that we're seeing because international travelers are not arriving is huge. So I'm not trying to say that domestic tourism is the only way forward. This is absolutely unrealistic, of course, as is using only alternative forms of tourism. But maybe other speakers have something to say about that as well, or maybe some other editors.
Anyone?
Yeah, maybe just
yeah.
Sorry. Just briefly to add on, and this is an important point, I believe, which was raised already by you, Claudia, the highlighting of the importance of domestic or regional markets. I mean, over the last few years, I organized quite some student excursions, student field trips with local students in the Asia Pacific. And students, our groups often had the feeling of somehow being treated as a second class type of tourism, showing that there's not much value given to domestic forms of tourism at resorts or even at other places. So this may change now, right? So in this period we are now in redeveloping tourism, we see that many countries now strongly focus on domestic tourism, and I think this has a couple of implications also in developing different forms of sustainable tourism throughout the region.
Okay.
Okay. I will also follow up the comments that Alex raised, and we will see in our book, when we take the tourism statistic, we actually base only on the international tourist figure. And that is a very common practice in many Southeast Asian countries. When they record the statistic of visitor arrival, they only report mainly on international visitors. So we can anticipate that for record for 2020, there's going to be a very sharp drop. But the domestic market has always been, and very long time, been underestimated by the business and also by the government officer, and also because the problem of very difficult to keep up with statistic on domestic market. However, as reflect on Alex's point, the domestic market sometimes is perceived as a low payment. Propensity to pay is lower. And that's why right after the COVID-19, like for example, in Vietnam, they start a very heavy promotion. So many promotion on the tour. And the problem is it creates a mass tourism because everyone rushed to travel right after the lockdown period. And what happened with many destinations is the hotel are running out of room, and then the destination getting very crowded. But the actual income coming back is limited because only a particular type of hotel might be open for that promotional package. So using promotion discount as a way to stimulate the market right after the pandemic would be a really big question. And also is a question of sustainable development and alternative development form for the domestic market, which is an area with really lack of research. And I would call for more attention to domestic market and more research on domestic tourism in Southeast Asia, which is playing more important role and increasing to be important in the future.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, I'll jump to one of the other questions that came through. And the question was about destination resilience and how Southeast Asian destinations can develop greater resilience in the face of external shocks. And of course, there's an expectation that there'll be more external shocks in the future, whether they be economic or climate related. Can you comment on that, anyone?
That is a very interesting question, Joseph. We actually published a couple of months ago, our team in Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University published one paper on the destination resilience. And we look at several cases in Southeast Asia. It's actually the resilience come from ability to adapt to the change. And that ability to adapt are actually coming from the internal strength and in kind of capacity from the local market and from the local entrepreneurs. So I would reflect on Southeast Asian country tourism development, which is depend on the modernization and dominant of the modernization form, which rely on foreign investment and foreign visitors. So now building the capacity for the local and building the capacity for community, and then they can survive. And now this acid test of COVID-19 proves that the community has to be very strong. And that is the core and the root to build the resilience for destination. And we take the case of Hoi An, where the community has been so used to and developed with tourism for many years, and they actually become more entrepreneurial and they adapt so quickly. When change happen, that local community who stay in their land, carry on their business, small scale business, but in very sustainable way. And I think the emergence of the domestic market will really...
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to add to that before I jump to the next question?
By the way, obviously the other contributors can also just unmute themselves and participate. It's not just editors. Yeah.
Yes, yes. One of the other questions that came through was one of the other questions that came through was what is the role of government?
Sorry, I think Dieter still wanted to.
Dieter, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's kind of combining, I guess, the two questions that were asked earlier. But I think, I mean, looking backward in order to understand the future, I mean, we have seen that SARS and even September 11th did not affect tourism in the long run very negatively. And I wouldn't expect COVID-19 to be actually the big game changer as well. I mean, I would rather think that climate change actually will be the big challenge for the future. And from that point of view, I think a lot of the ideas about becoming more regional, becoming more domestic in terms of tourism systems, I think is certainly a way forward. And I think to a certain extent, I think this development is already taking place, as you already kind of also illustrated in your early presentations today. I mean, where you see that the regional markets have become far more important than this kind of traditional idea of, kind of Europeans or North Americans coming to the southeast of Asia and solving everything or something like that. I mean, I think those ideas are already today very much obsolete in a way. And I think this kind of regionalization also would create, of course, a greater resilience in relation to future changes. So I mean, I guess we are already on the way there. But that, of course, requires kind of strong demand markets. And I know we have, I mean, in the region, a lot of growth-oriented governments that obviously are very interested in developing tourism further and attracting tourists and the economic benefits that are anticipated that it would bring along. So I think we will see kind of a tourism development that is maybe more regional and from that point also more sustainable in a way in the future. But on the other hand, I mean, the question is then, do those destinations have offers that are appealing to those markets that are the newly emerging ones?
Okay. Thank you, Dieter. That's a comprehensive response to both questions. One of the questions that came through was the role of government. As we know that Southeast Asian countries have had a long period of political stability relatively, and which has helped economic growth. So what is the most effective role that government can play in tourism for anyone? Or maybe the government should stay out of it completely.
It's interesting that nobody is answering it. Yeah. I think this is actually a very difficult question because, as we know, in most of the Asian countries, we also have tourism ministries. For example, in Germany, we don't have a tourism ministry. Tourism is mostly managed at state level or even at municipality level, but not at the national level. What is the role of the governments? For me, it's really setting up policies, setting up maybe standards, helping to open up borders. We're talking now about regional tourism, but this is still an issue also for Asia, open borders. You still can't cross with your own car from Thailand to Myanmar and vice versa. And as long as we depend on these kind of or as long as the borders are closed for this kind of transportation, it's difficult because that means we still rely only on planes, on flights. So from my point of view, government should, it's more also working at national level, working together with the other governments to support tourism development in the region and making sure that regional tourism actually can happen.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, thank you. And I also think we find quite some differences in regards to government involvement in tourism in the countries across Southeast Asia. So if you think about Thailand, especially in the early decades of tourism development in the 1950s, 1960s, lots of tourism was driven and marketed by small and medium scale businesses, especially if we think about ethnic tourism, which was quite different from countries which just opened up for tourism in the 1990s, such as Vietnam or Laos, where government agencies together with the private sector played an important role in developing tourism almost from scratch. And I also think that Myanmar is quite an interesting case where one could further discuss the role of the government in tourism development. I mean, I remember, I think it was until 2011 when the previous military government was in place, where we had lots of international tourism boycotts of traveling to Myanmar because of the actions of the military government. And now also more recently, in recent years, in relation to the Rohingya crisis, voices raised their concerns again about traveling to countries where obviously human rights violations take place.
Okay. Jump in now if you have a comment. Otherwise, I'll go to the next question and probably the last question, and then the editors can wrap up. This is a question that is not only applicable to Southeast Asia, but tourism development in the Global South in general. And the question was about economic trickle-down and how can we overcome constrained economic trickle-down? I know that's a difficult question. Any comments or attempts to try and suggest?
I mean, I could say something on that, since our chapter is a little bit on that topic actually, and where this idea in Laos was very much kind of tourism as a tool for really kind of serving the poorest of the poor, and in its current practice it did not work like that, and I think it really requires a far more hands-on approach to actually capacity building and things like that in order to make those people being able of taking part in the tourism business, so to say. And I think that has not been that has not been the case. I think it's not a particular Asian problem or challenge. It's something that we can see everywhere, all over the place. But I think, I mean, also related to the question that was posed earlier on the role of government, I think there is something where government actually could engage to a far greater extent than today, meaning that, kind of capacity building programs that actually enable people to participate in tourism. But then on the other hand, I mean, as a geographer, I should also say, I mean, it's also a question of infrastructure, considering the accessibility to some of the places that could be a part of tourism, but are not, simply because they cannot be reached.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to add to what Dieter is saying, so that actually I do think, and that's probably something that comes out in our book as well, and probably in this whole book launch today, is really the importance of local ownership. So as Dieter says, local ownership can only happen when there is local capacity, and when there is actually microfinance available from organizations, from governments, from supranational organizations, from potentially development banks. So it's about local ownership that I would really like to emphasize here, but something really that we have to look at across the whole value chain of tourism. So it's simply not enough to have local ownership simply in the homestay. So it's really more that we need here, and I think we do see we do still see strong potentially is something that could be changing in the future. Not sure this is particularly, as Dieter says, an Asian or Southeast Asian issue, more so than a potentially developing region issue, I would say. Mm-hmm. So yeah, time to rethink potentially.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia. Someone else wanted to say something?
Can I add something?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so in the case of our chapter, the environmental impact is sometimes also hindering the economic trickle-down effect, I believe, because in the case of the Thousand Island Regency, the islands which are closer to Jakarta, which have been impacted the most by the waves of garbage, is actually now left behind because tourists are searching for cleaner islands further north, the islands. So the left behind islands are all residential islands. They long for tourists right now, but people are starting to go, to leave them to go further away to the northern part of the islands. So it is not really equal between one island to the other because of these environmental impacts. Yeah, that's my addition.
All right. I think there's a few more questions here, but I think we should probably wrap up. And one final comment, more than anything, some of the questions talked about the geopolitical nature of Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly, right? And how this might have an impact on not just the tourism industry, but on the region totally. The tensions between China and the US and all of the ramifications of that in the region. But of course, that's a bigger question. Perhaps we should save that for volume 2. So perhaps the editors can consider that. So with that, congratulations once again to all of the editors and the authors. I'll hand over to the editors to do a final wrap up before we finish this webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, Joseph. I just wanted to wrap up really with the social media prizes. So I do hope that this is working. One second. Okay. I'm hoping you can hear me. Yes. I wanted to say thank you so much for the huge response we had in the names of all the editors and probably also the contributors to our social media prize drawing. Quite a few people have entered the prize drawing, but of course we only have 3 prizes. So we have 3 copies of the book to give away for free, and we are going to award them to those that have actually shared our flyer most or on most diverse channels. And these include LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and other channels I've probably never heard about before, but quite diverse channels. So thank you so much for everyone for sharing this. So I'm gonna read out the names. So we have prize number 1. So 1 copy of the book is going to Eda Molla Hussein. She is a University of Westminster student and has shared this post hugely, and actually the most of everyone who has entered the prize drawing. So congratulations, Eda, for sharing this. You're going to get a free copy of the book, and I'm going to be in touch with you in terms of your address. The second prize is going to someone who's actually based in the region, which I'm very delighted about. And the name is Dr. Wiwig Sushartami. I think she is actually in the launch at the moment. I've seen her name earlier. So congratulations. Thanks for sharing this. And I'm going to be in touch with you as well later on. So she's actually based at Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia. And the third prize will be going to Kusita Putratana from Thailand. She is currently a PhD student at the University of Vienna. So these are our 3 social media prizes. Congratulations. They are going to be posted to you. Routledge has not been printing for a while, but is resuming printing now after the pandemic. Well, not after, it's not definitely over, but these will be coming your way very soon. Well, thank you all so much for joining today's book launch. I think nobody else has any more comments, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Joseph, would you like to round up?
Okay. Once again, Congratulations to the editors. If you have a librarian that you know, please get them to buy the book. As we know, it's always important that the book is read. If you have remaining questions, I'm sure the authors or the editors wouldn't mind you contacting them directly. So please feel free to look them up. I hope when we are involved in launching Volume 2, we are in better times, right? So with that, I say thank you and take care and be well, everyone.